The frost hadn't burned off the stubble fields by the time the first trucks began parking along the county road, engines idling, breath fogging behind cracked windshields. By 9 that morning, 40-some vehicles lined the fence row of a 640-acre wheat and hay operation outside Lewistown, Montana. Their owners gathered in small clusters with coffee thermoses and the particular silence of people who know they are about to watch something die. Nobody said the word vulture out loud. They didn't have to. The auctioneer, a wiry man in a canvas coat who'd been hired by the county treasurer's office to liquidate what remained of a life's work, walked the yard with a clipboard, checking serial numbers against a typed inventory sheet. Grain augers, a dissied-up set of harrows, a hay rake with a bent tine, and at the center of the gravel lot, parked as if it still had work to do, sat a 1974 Case IH 1066, its red paint faded to the color of dried blood, 11,400 hours logged on a gauge that hadn't worked accurately since the Reagan administration. The 68-year-old man who'd farmed this ground for 44 years stood apart from the crowd, near the porch of a house his grandfather had built in 1958 after homesteading the section. He didn't approach the tractor. He didn't need to. He knew every dent in that hood, every hairline crack in the cab glass, the exact place where the clutch pedal had been welded twice. His grandfather had paid $19,800 for that machine new, back when that kind of money on a wheat farm meant something close to faith. Two men from out of state moved through the crowd with a different kind of attention, the kind that priced things by weight rather than memory. Word had already spread that they were salvage buyers, here to bid the old iron up to scrap value and haul it off in pieces. Nobody in the crowd much liked it, but nobody had the cash or the standing to stop it either. $61,000 in back taxes and lender debt had a way of making silence the only appropriate response. Then a truck nobody recognized pulled in slow past the mailbox, tires crunching gravel, and parked at the edge of the lot instead of near the equipment. A man got out, maybe 45, unhurried, wearing a canvas jacket with no dealership logo, no company name stenciled on the door of his truck. He didn't reach for a bidder's number right away. He walked straight to the 1066, crouched by the front axle, and ran his fingers along a weld seam like he was reading Braille. The crowd assumed the worst kind of stranger, another buyer come to strip the last thing this family had left of its beginning. They had no idea yet how wrong they were. To understand why that weld seam mattered enough for a stranger to run his fingers over it before he'd even glanced at the auctioneer, you had to go back further than the drought, further than the county's tax notice, back to 1958, when a younger, harder-handed version of this operator's grandfather filed a homestead claim on 640 acres of rolling wheat ground north of Lewistown in Fergus County, where the wind came down off the Judith Mountains with nothing to slow it, and the soil was thin enough in places that a man learned quick which fields would feed a family and which would break one. He built the operation the way most in that country did, slow, mortgaged and stubborn, running a mixed herd for the first decade while he broke sod for wheat, and taking on custom harvesting work for neighboring outfits every July and August to bring in cash the land itself couldn't yet provide. He did that for 16 years, combined other men's wheat, greased other men's headers, slept in the cab more nights than not during cutting season, and set aside what he could into a coffee can and later a savings passbook at the bank in Lewistown, refusing every year to touch it no matter how lean the winter got. By 1974, that patience had become $19,800 in saved cash, an enormous sum for a dryland operation that size in that decade, and he walked into the International Harvester dealership in town and paid for a brand new Case IH1066 without financing a dollar of it. No note, no lien, no bank standing between him and the machine. Men in the co-op still talked about it decades later, the way you talk about a thing that seems almost reckless in its plainness. A man who cut other people's wheat for 16 summers so he'd never have to owe anyone for his own tractor. The 1066 came off the truck with 0 hours on the meter and a 100-horsepower engine that made it, at the time, one of the largest pieces of iron in that end of the county. He ran it on the same 640 acres his grandson farmed still, through wheat and hay rotations, through blizzards and combine breakdowns, and one bad hailstorm in 1979 that flattened half the crop but left the tractor untouched in the shed. Every one of those early hours, plowing, seeding, hauling, had been logged, informally at first and then with increasing care, at the dealership where a young mechanic, not much older than the farmer himself, had learned the machine's quirks before either of them understood how long that acquaintance would last, or what it would eventually come to mean, 40-some years and one auction lot later. That young mechanic in Lewistown kept his records the way some men keep scripture, in a spiral-bound ledger with a cracked green cover, entries made in pencil first, then gone over in ink once the work was confirmed and paid. By the time the operator's grandfather handed the farm down, that ledger held better than 2 decades of history on serial number 8302614, oil changes at 100-hour intervals when the manual called for 150, injector work in 1981, a clutch replacement in 1986 that the mechanic noted in his small cramped hand as labor only, parts consigned. The tractor crossed 5,000 hours sometime in the winter of 1983, a milestone the ledger marked with nothing more than a single underlined number, as if the machine itself understood the weight of it. By the time the operator took over the deed and the debt and the disking in 1980, the 1066 had already outlived 2 of the neighbor's newer machines, Deere and Massey alike, both traded in or scrapped for engines that couldn't take the abuse a Montana wheat season handed out season after season. He was 24 when the operation became his in name as well as practice, and from that year forward, the tractor's hours accumulated under his own hand, not his grandfather's. Seeding in April, summer fallow work through June, hauling grain in August heat that cracked the paint on the hood, and always, every autumn, the ritual of running it into Lewistown for whatever the mechanic said it needed before winter set in. The engine came apart entirely 3 times over the tractor's life, once in 1978, once in 1991, and a final rebuild in 2003 that used a reconditioned block because a new one wasn't available anymore, for a diesel engine that had gone effectively obsolete in the eyes of the dealership network that replaced it with newer, computerized platforms the operator never trusted and never bought. Each rebuild was logged, dated, itemized, the pencil giving way eventually to a dot matrix printer, and then, in the mechanic's last years before retiring in 1994, back to handwriting again, as if age had returned him to the only method he ever fully trusted. By the time the meter read 11,400 hours, a number the operator could recite without checking, the way another man might recite a birthday, the tractor had planted and harvested more of that 640 acres than any other machine the family had ever owned, including 2 newer tractors bought and sold in the years between, both of which had failed to outlast it. 44 years the operator had walked those same fields, first behind his grandfather's shadow and then alone, watching drought years and wet years pass through the same dark soil, watching prices for wheat rise and fall against a debt that never entirely disappeared, and always, in the corner of the machine shed, the green tractor waiting, patient as the ledger that recorded it, indifferent to the mounting weight of the paperwork now gathering, unnoticed by anyone yet, in a filing cabinet at the county treasurer's office. The paperwork, when it finally arrived, did not announce itself as an ending. It came the way most endings do in farm country, quietly, in a county envelope, tucked between a seed catalog and a co-op statement, easy to set aside on the kitchen table for a day, then a week, until setting it aside was no longer possible. The first drought had come 2 summers earlier, the kind that cracked the topsoil into plates and turned the wheat stunted and pale before July even finished, yielding 11 bushels an acre on ground that had given 38 the year before. He had absorbed that loss the way he had absorbed others over 4 decades, tightening what could be tightened, deferring what could be deferred, trusting that Montana weather owed him nothing but occasionally paid anyway. But the second drought did not relent. It sat over Fergus County for 14 months, and the wheat that did grow met a market already sliding, prices dropping from $7.40 a bushel to $5.10 in the space of a single crop year, the kind of number that looked small on a chart and devastating on a ledger. Hay cuttings, usually a second income to lean on, came in thin and late, sold for less than the diesel it cost to bale them. By the time he sat down that winter with the stack of statements spread across the same table his grandfather had once used to plan the 1958 homestead, the number had a shape he could not argue with: $61,000. Some of it was back taxes to the county. 3 years accumulated and compounding with penalties he hadn't fully understood until he read the fine print twice. The rest was owed to a regional ag lender who had financed a land purchase years earlier, a modest expansion meant to secure the operation's future, now a weight dragging against a present that offered no cushion. He had made partial payments where he could, sold 2 head of cattle he'd meant to keep, skipped a fertilizer application he knew he'd regret come spring. None of it had been enough to outrun the math. The notice from the county treasurer's office used careful, bureaucratic language: delinquent obligations, scheduled liquidation, public sale to satisfy outstanding balances, but its meaning was plain enough to a man who had read balance sheets his whole life. A date was set. An auctioneer would be retained. The county's authority to force the sale of property, real or personal, to recover what was owed was not something he could negotiate away with good intentions or 44 years of unbroken tenancy. He read the letter twice at the kitchen table, then folded it along its original crease and set it beside the ledger drawer where his grandfather's old receipts still lived, as if proximity to that older paperwork might somehow soften what the new paperwork demanded of him. The regional lender's office sat 2 blocks off Main Street in Lewistown, a low brick building with a flag out front and a parking lot that never had more than 4 trucks in it at once. He drove there on a Tuesday morning in late February, wearing the same canvas coat he wore to move cattle, because a suit would have felt like a lie about who he was. He carried a folder, tax records, yield reports going back a decade, the maintenance logs for the 1066 that showed a machine still capable of a full day's work despite its age. He believed, the way a man believes in the fairness of numbers he has kept honestly, that the folder would speak for him. The loan officer was younger than he expected, maybe 40, with a laminated badge and a laptop open before he'd even finished sitting down. He listened for perhaps 6 minutes. He asked about acreage, about yield, about the drought years, nodding at each answer as though confirming something he already suspected. Then he turned the laptop slightly, not quite toward the operator, and said that the bank's hardship program required collateral valuation consistent with the outstanding balance, and that a 48-year-old tractor, however well maintained, was carrying resale numbers that made it, in the loan officer's phrase, an obsolete asset, worth, by the bank's own depreciation schedule, a fraction of what remained owed against the land. The word obsolete landed the way a slap lands, quiet and total. He tried to explain that the 1066 had pulled every disc, planted every acre, and hauled every bale on that farm for 4 decades without a rebuild beyond routine wear parts. That 11,400 hours on an engine of that era, properly serviced, meant something a spreadsheet couldn't capture. The loan officer said he understood the sentiment, but sentiment wasn't collateral. The extension was denied. The county's timeline would proceed as scheduled. He drove home with the folder on the seat beside him, unopened again, and did not speak of it to anyone for 3 days. But Fergus County was not large enough to keep a humiliation contained. Someone's cousin worked at the bank. Someone's brother-in-law had been in the lobby. By the following week, the story had reached the coffee shop on Main Street, retold in the particular way small towns retell things, with sympathy on the surface and something colder underneath, an unspoken verdict about a man who had let his equipment, and by extension his judgment, fall behind the times. A few old friends still greeted him the same as always. Others found reasons not to meet his eye at the elevator or the feed store, as if bad luck were a thing that could be caught. He noticed it. He said nothing about that either. He simply went home each evening and stood a while in the shed, running one hand along the fender of the 1066, listening to the wind work at the loose sheet metal on the roof, and tried to decide what a man does when the bank has already decided what his history is worth. The letter from the county treasurer's office arrived on a Tuesday in late February, printed on the same pale green stationery the office had used for 30 years, and it did what the bank's denial had not. It made the matter official, dated, unappealable. The sale was set for the second Saturday in April, on the property itself, all listed assets to be sold at public auction to satisfy the outstanding balance of $61,000 owed jointly to Fergus County and the regional ag lender. Among the listed assets, typed without ceremony between a grain auger and 3 sections of harrow, was the 1974 Case IH1066, serial number 8302614, 1,400 hours, condition noted only as operational as is. He read the letter twice at the kitchen table, then folded it along its original creases and set it beneath the sugar bowl, where it stayed for the better part of a week before he could bring himself to walk out to the shed and begin the work of preparing a machine for a sale he had never imagined making. He changed the oil one final time, not because it needed it, but because it seemed wrong to hand the tractor over dirty. He touched up the chipped red paint on the hood with a rattle can bought at the co-op, knowing it wouldn't matter to a buyer looking to strip it for parts, and doing it anyway. He gathered what paperwork he had, the original bill of sale from 1974, a few maintenance receipts from the Lewistown dealership going back decades, though many of the earliest years were missing, lost somewhere between house fires, moves, and the ordinary erosion of 44 years, and set them in a folder to be handed to whoever bought it, so the machine would not go into a stranger's hands without its history attached, even if no one asked for it. Word moved through the county the way it always did, faster than any printed notice, and by the time April approached, the general assumption at the coffee shop and the elevator had already hardened into something like consensus. The tractor was old. Parts for the 1066 were harder to find every year, and what buyers wanted now were the newer, larger GPS-guided machines the dealerships pushed. A 1974 model with over 11,000 hours, however well it had been kept, was worth more broken into pieces than whole. An axle here, a transmission there, sold off to some salvage operation working out of Idaho or the Dakotas. Nobody said this to his face. They said it to each other, over coffee, with the particular resignation of people watching something inevitable arrive on schedule, the way weather arrives, the way debt arrives, and they assumed, without much discussion, that some out-of-state buyer with a flatbed trailer and no interest in the land or the family would be the one standing there when the auctioneer's gavel finally came down. 3 months before any of this, in a cinder-block shop on the north edge of Lewistown, a man in his mid-40s had been going through the accumulated inventory of a life he had inherited and did not know what to do with. His grandfather had died in late November, 86 years old, and had spent the better part of 6 decades in that same shop, first as a salaried mechanic for the International Harvester dealership on Main Street, and then, after the dealership closed its doors in 1994, as an independent who kept working on the same machines for the same customers out of the same building because that was simply what he did. The shop smelled of cold grease and rust, and the particular mustiness of paper that had sat undisturbed for years. There were parts bins labeled in handwriting that had grown shakier decade by decade, invoices going back to the Nixon administration, and, on a shelf behind a stack of obsolete carburetor kits, a row of composition notebooks with black marbled covers, their pages swollen from humidity, that the grandson had almost thrown into the dumpster without opening. He had opened one anyway, mostly out of the reflexive guilt of discarding something a dead man had bothered to keep. Inside, in pencil and later in blue ballpoint, was a service ledger: dates, customer names, machine descriptions, parts used, hours billed, and sometimes hours crossed out and written over with a lower number, or no number at all. He had sat on an overturned bucket for the better part of an afternoon, reading entries that meant nothing to him until he came to a name he recognized from around the county, and beneath it, a serial number, 8302614. It appeared again 3 pages later. And again, spanning nearly 2 decades, a 1974 case IH-1066, serviced with a regularity that read less like routine maintenance and more like a quiet, ongoing obligation. Oil system rebuilds, injector pump work, a transmission overhaul in 1983, billed at a fraction of what the parts alone should have cost. And in the margin beside that entry, in his grandfather's hand, 4 words: "No charge, per agreement." He did not know yet what the agreement had been. He only knew that his grandfather had never spoken of debts owed to him, had died with a small savings account and an unremarkable house, and had nonetheless spent 20 years quietly subsidizing the survival of one particular tractor and, it seemed, one particular family. He set the notebook aside that afternoon without fully understanding its weight, filed it with the others in a cardboard box destined for the Historical Society donation pile, and went back to sorting wrenches, not yet knowing that the serial number pressed into a cracked block 100 miles east would, within 3 months, pull him out of that shop and onto a gravel lot where an auctioneer's voice was already rising over a crowd that had already decided how the day would end. The ledger, once he began reading it in sequence rather than skimming for the serial number, told a story that no bank statement ever could. It began in October of 1974, a clean entry in a steadier hand, delivery inspection, fluid levels, torque specifications recorded to the foot-pound, the kind of care a young mechanic gives a machine he expects to know for decades. Through the back half of that decade, the entries stayed routine: seasonal servicing, a hydraulic line replaced in 1977, a starter rebuilt in 1979, each billed at standard dealership rates with the operator's grandfather's name entered plainly at the top of the page. There was nothing yet to suggest the tractor was anything more to the mechanic than one machine among the dozens he serviced out of the Lewistown dealership floor. The shift began in 1981, when wheat prices collapsed and interest rates climbed past 18%, and half the county's operators were carrying loans they could no longer service. The entries in the ledger did not announce this collapse directly. The mechanic was not a man given to commentary, but the arithmetic of the pages began to change. A fuel injection repair in November of that year showed a parts cost with no corresponding labor charge. A brake system overhaul in the spring of 1982 was billed at $40 against what should have been closer to $300, and running beside these entries, in small, disciplined handwriting, were notes that read less like invoices and more like a private accounting kept for no one but himself. Waiting on harvest. Good man will settle when he can. By 1983, the pattern was unmistakable. The transmission overhaul that year, the one billed at a fraction of parts, cost with wood. No charge, per agreement. Written in the margin, came during a season when half the farms bordering the operator's grandfather's land were being sold at forced auction, their equipment scattered to salvage buyers exactly like the ones now circling in Fergus County 4 decades later. The mechanic had watched that happen to neighbors and customers alike, had watched dealerships repossess machines from men he'd serviced for a decade, and had apparently decided, without ever writing down why, that this one tractor and this one family would not join them. The agreement itself was never spelled out on paper, no promissory note, no signature, nothing a bank examiner or a county auditor could have pointed to. It existed only as a pattern of restraint repeated year after year, a mechanic quietly absorbing costs he had no obligation to absorb, for a man who apparently never fully repaid him and, by every indication in the ledger, was never asked to. The entries continued through 1994, growing sparser as the tractor aged and needed less, until the final page, a routine oil change, dated that spring, with no note beside it at all, as though the account, whatever it truly was, had simply been allowed to remain open. Auction day came in cold and clear, the kind of Fergus County morning where the frost burns off by 9 and leaves the gravel lot smelling of diesel and wet hay. By 8:30, 31 vehicles lined the county road, and by 9 the crowd had settled into the particular stillness of people who had come to watch a neighbor lose something, whether or not they'd admit that was why they'd come. The auctioneer worked through the smaller lots first. A grain drill, 2 flatbed trailers, a stack of fence posts bundled and sold in lots of 50, his voice climbing and falling in that practiced rhythm that made loss sound almost like commerce, almost like nothing at all. The operator stood near the shop door with his hands in his coat pockets, not moving, watching each item leave the yard the way a man watches weather he can no longer do anything about. When the auctioneer finally called the tractor forward, something in the crowd's posture changed. Necks turned. Conversations dropped to half volume. The 1066 sat where it had been parked for 2 days, its faded red paint dulled by 49 winters, the exhaust stack tilted slightly from age. 11,400 hours pressed into its history like a brand no one could see, but everyone in that yard understood. The auctioneer opened with a number low enough to draw blood, $6,000, and the 2 out-of-state buyers, standing apart from the local crowd near a flatbed trailer hitched and ready, answered almost before he'd finished speaking. They moved the price up in quick, businesslike increments, the way men do when they already know what a machine is worth in pieces and don't care what it's worth standing whole. 7,000. 895. The crowd murmured with each jump, a low current of disbelief that a tractor everyone in the county had watched work fields for half a century might end its life shredded into a parts bin 2 states away. The operator's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, because there was nothing left in his hands to say with. Somewhere behind him, A rancher muttered that it was a damn shame, and another voice answered that shame didn't pay back taxes. At 10,200, the salvage buyers exchanged a glance, confident, unhurried, the posture of men who had done this in a dozen counties before and expected this one to end the same way. The auctioneer's chant slowed for half a beat, testing the silence, and in that pause the crowd seemed to lean forward all at once, sensing, without knowing why, that the number was about to move in a direction none of them had accounted for. The stranger's hand went up without ceremony, without the theater the salvage men had practiced for years of county sales like this one. He simply raised it, held it there, and said a number that landed heavier in the cold air than the volume of his voice suggested it should. 11,000. The auctioneer, a man who had sold combines, cattle, and once an entire dairy herd in a single Saturday afternoon, paused just long enough to register that the bid had come from a face he did not recognize, standing apart from both the salvage men and the ring of neighbors who had known one another's cattle brands for 3 generations. He called it anyway, because a bid was a bid, and the salvage buyers answered almost lazily, certain the newcomer was some hobbyist who would fold at the first real pressure. 11,800. The stranger did not blink. 12,500. Their glance flicked toward each other again, less confident now, recalculating the math of scrap steel against whatever this man seemed willing to spend. 13,000. A ripple moved through the crowd, farmers glancing at one another, trying to place him, murmuring guesses. An equipment restorer, a wealthy collector, someone's cousin from Great Falls, none of it fitting the plain canvas coat and work-scarred hands that didn't belong to a man chasing nostalgia for sport. The older of the 2 salvage buyers finally spoke a number with less certainty in it, 13,600, testing whether the stranger's resolve had a ceiling. It did not. 14,000 came out of him steady, almost quiet, the way a man states a fact rather than makes an offer, and something in the delivery made the salvage buyers go still. They exchanged one last look, weighing photographs of scrap prices against the sudden, uncomfortable sense that they had wandered into a transaction they did not fully understand, and then, without another word, they lowered their paddle. The auctioneer's voice climbed anyway, chasing the momentum out of old habit, and the stranger answered it one final time. $14,200, flat, unhurried, final. The gavel came down into a silence thicker than the one that had opened the bidding. No one clapped, no one spoke. The operator stood with his hat in both hands, staring at a man he had never met, unable to reconcile the sum just spent on a machine everyone else in the yard had priced only in scrap metal fractions. Neighbors turned to one another, searching for an explanation that made sense of a stranger paying 4 times the metal's worth for a tractor with no name they knew attached to it, not understanding yet that the bid had nothing to do with the tractor's iron, and everything to do with a debt none of them had ever been told existed. The stranger reached into the cab of his truck, parked at the edge of the gravel lot where the crowd had drifted without noticing his approach, and came back carrying a book. It was not large, a shop ledger, the kind sold by the dozen at any farm supply store in the 1970s, its cover worn soft and gray at the corners, its spine cracked from decades of being opened flat on a workbench. He did not raise his voice. He simply walked to where the operator stood, still holding his hat, and opened the ledger to a page marked with a strip of masking tape yellowed with age. He read the entry aloud, plainly, the way a man reads something he has rehearsed only in his head. March 1983. Case IH 1066, serial 83022614. Invector pump rebuild, parts and labor, no charge, followed by 5 words in a different hand, added later, good for it, on trust. Beneath that, another entry from October 1985, and another from the spring of 1987, each one the same shape. Work performed, payment deferred, the debt marked settled not in dollars but in a single word: handshake. The crowd had gone still in a different way now, no longer confused but listening, the auctioneer himself lowering his clipboard as the stranger explained who his grandfather had been, the mechanic at the old International Harvester dealership on the north end of Lewistown, the man who had kept this tractor running through the worst years the county had seen, and who had never once sent a bill for it, because the operator's grandfather had, in turn, done things for him that never appeared on any invoice either. Grain hauled, a roof mended, trust extended in both directions, recorded nowhere but in this book. Then he said the part that mattered most. He had not bought the tractor to keep it. He had bought it to give it back. Not as a gift, because neither family had ever dealt in gifts, but as a loan, structured plain and simple. The operator would repay the $14,200 out of next year's wheat check, after harvest, at no interest, the same way his grandfather had once been carried through lean seasons by a man who believed a debt of goodwill was still a debt. The operator's hands tightened on the brim of his hat. He did not trust his voice yet to answer. Around them, the neighbors who had come expecting a liquidation were beginning to understand that they were witnessing something else entirely. An old account, buried for 40 years in a mechanic's careful handwriting, finally being settled in the open air of a county auction lot, in front of everyone who had once doubted there was anything left worth saving. The county treasurer's office finalized the arrangement within the week. The $61,000 owed was never erased by a single stroke of good fortune, the way a lesser telling of this story might insist. It came apart the way real debt always comes apart on a working farm. In pieces, through patience, through paperwork signed at 3 different desks. The proceeds from the auction itself, minus the returned tractor, covered a portion. The regional ag lender, faced now with a documented history of the operation's 44 years of continuous production and a renegotiated payment schedule spread across 18 months, agreed to terms it had refused to consider 3 months earlier when the hardship extension request sat denied on a loan officer's desk. The remainder was carried privately, quietly, in the form of the $14,200 the operator now owed not to a bank, but to a man he had met only that afternoon, repayable after the wheat came in. Planting season arrived on schedule that spring, cold and dry the way Fergus County springs often are, and the 1074 hours already logged since the mechanic's grandson had walked away from the auction lot became 11,400, and then, slowly, more. The tractor pulled the drill across all 640 acres without complaint, the same engine block that had first turned over in a dealership bay in 1974, the same hydraulics a careful hand had bled and rebled for 2 decades before either of the men now responsible for its survival had been born. The wheat came up thin in places that first year, thick in others, but it came up, and at harvest the check was large enough to satisfy the private loan in full, without interest, exactly as promised, exactly as it had once been promised to a different generation. The handwritten ledger did not stay in a shop drawer or a farmhouse desk. It went, at the mechanic's grandson's insistence, to the Fergus County Historical Society, catalogued and shelved beside deeds and homestead patents and other records of how the county had actually survived the decades the banks preferred to forget. Anyone could request to see it. Anyone could read, in a dead man's steady hand, how 2 families neither rich nor connected had kept each other upright through drought, through debt, through a farm crisis that had buried better financed operations than this one. What the auction lot had almost proven that day was that memory belongs to whoever owns the largest ledger, the biggest bank, the loudest claim on obsolescence. What it proved instead was older and quieter than that a debt of goodwill, entered nowhere but in careful handwriting, can outlast 40 years, outlast liquidation, outlast every institution built to erase it, and come due exactly when it's needed most.